I found the supplies on a Thursday, 17 days after I sealed the bunker entrance. I was organizing the canned goods on the metal shelf unit against the west wall when I noticed the space behind them. A gap that shouldn't have been there. The shelf is 8 feet long, and I had bought exactly 96 cans of various vegetables, beans, and meats from the grocery distribution center before the roads became impassable. 96 cans. I had counted them twice. I remember because I had arranged them in rows of 12, stacking them 5 high. That's the kind of detail that becomes important later. That's the kind of thing you remember after you realize you're not alone. The gap was approximately 2 feet wide, positioned right in the middle of the shelf where the cans should have been most tightly packed. Behind the gap, pushed back against the wall where it wouldn't be visible from the entrance of the storage room, was a cardboard box. Not a large box, approximately 12 inches by 8 inches by 6 inches. The kind of box that might contain supplies from a different era. The kind of box that I'd absolutely not put there. I stood in front of the shelf for a long time, holding a can of green beans in one hand, trying to convince myself that I'd made a counting error. That perhaps I had purchased 94 cans instead of 96. That perhaps I had simply misremembered. That perhaps there was a reasonable explanation for a box of unknown origin to be sitting on my shelf in my bunker, which had been sealed for 17 days. The box was old, not ancient, but old enough that the cardboard had yellowed and the tape used to seal it had lost most of its adhesive. I could see that it had been handled multiple times. The corners were soft, crushed from repeated contact. The label on the top was handwritten. The ink faded to a pale brown. The writing said, "Ration Kit, July 2019. Not recently placed. Not something added in the past 3 weeks. Something that had been there for at least 4 years, possibly longer. Something that had been waiting untouched for someone to find it." I extracted the box from the shelf carefully, as if it might contain something that could harm me if I wasn't gentle with it. My hands were shaking slightly. I remember noticing that. I remember thinking that it was strange to feel afraid in my own bunker, in the space I had prepared specifically to be safe. Or inside the box were supplies, medical supplies primarily, bandages, antiseptic wipes, a bottle of ibuprofen with a label indicating it had been purchased in early 2019. There was a small first aid manual, the pages already yellowed and slightly brittle. There was a plastic bag containing what appeared to be antibiotic cream, the kind you can purchase over the counter for minor infections. There was a bottle of multivitamins. There was a flashlight, the batteries long since dead. And there was something else, a notebook, spiral-bound, small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. The pages were filled with handwriting. The writing was small, precise, and dense. Someone had filled every available space on every page with words. "My name is Thomas Garrett. I'm 43 years old. I worked as a building inspector for the city. My job was to assess the structural integrity of buildings, to ensure they met code requirements, to identify issues before they became dangerous. I had been doing this job for 16 years. I was good at it. I understood how buildings work. I understood how to look at something and determine whether it was sound or whether it had problems that would eventually cause failure. The bunker I built followed the same logic. I understood what I was doing. I had plans I had prepared carefully. The fact that there was a box of supplies in my bunker that I didn't put there was not something that fit into my understanding of how my own preparedness worked. The outbreak began on a Tuesday in April. I remember because I had been scheduled to inspect a residential building in the northern part of the city, and I had to reschedule the appointment. By Wednesday, the roads were being closed. By Friday, the government was advising people to shelter in place. The infection vector was never clearly explained. There were theories: airborne transmission, waterborne contamination, some kind of vector-borne pathogen transmitted through insect bites. The official explanation shifted multiple times as the situation escalated. What was clear was that the infected became aggressive. They lost cognitive function. They became violent and difficult to contain. Within 2 weeks, the city was under lockdown. Within 3 weeks, the electricity was going in and out unpredictably. By the time I sealed the bunker entrance, the streets were empty, except for people who were clearly in the advanced stages of infection. People who were no longer entirely human. People who had become something else. Psychic, the bunker had been my insurance policy. I had built it 5 years earlier, during a period when I was concerned about economic collapse, though I couldn't quite articulate why. It was a feeling more than a conviction, a sense that the world was becoming less stable, that systems were becoming more fragile. I had some money, I had time, I had the skills to do the work myself. The bunker was in the basement of the house I owned, about 2 miles from the city center. It was a concrete-lined space, approximately 15 feet by 30 feet, sealed from the main basement by a steel door that I had installed myself. The ventilation system was a series of filters and hand-cranked pumps that could provide adequate air circulation if the power went out. The water system relied on a well that I had tapped into, each with the pump mechanism designed to function even without electricity. The supplies had been accumulated gradually over 5 years, not in a panicked way, just methodically. Once per month, I would add a few cans to the shelf, a few gallons of water, a battery, a bit more food. The intention had always been that this was preparation for something that might never happen. The bunker was supposed to be insurance I would never need to use. The notation on the first page of the notebook was dated October 14th, 2019. The handwriting was different from what I had expected. I had imagined it might be old, deteriorated, the product of someone writing in difficult conditions. But it was neat. It was deliberate. It was the handwriting of someone who was taking time to write carefully, who was thinking about the words they were selecting. And the first entry said, "Found the water pump, it works. Drank from the tap without filtering. Probably not wise, but I was thirsty. The bunker's in good condition. Whoever built this place knew what they were doing. Structural integrity appears sound. The ventilation system is more sophisticated than I expected. There's a hand crank air pump with filters. Someone invested significant resources in this space. I need to figure out who, and I need to determine if they're coming back." The entries continued from that point, dated at irregular intervals. Some entries were several days apart. Some were only hours apart. The person who had written them had been living in my bunker, had been surviving in my bunker, had been using my supplies, or at least some of them. The earliest entries were from October 2019. And the most recent entry was dated July 12th, 2020. More than a year of continuous notes documenting someone else's occupation of the space that was supposed to be my safe space. Someone had been here, had lived here, had possibly died here since the entries stopped in July of 2020, and it was now April of 2021. 6 months of silence after the last entry. I sat down on the concrete floor of the storage room. I remember the cold of the concrete through my pants. I remember the feeling of unreality. The bunker was supposed to be a refuge. I had sealed it. I had closed the hatch above the stairs and bolted it from the inside. I had verified that the seal was complete. I had spent a full day checking every possible entry point. There was no way someone could have gotten in after I sealed it. We checked the ventilation system was a two-way valve that would allow air to enter and exit, but the openings were small, designed to prevent rodents and larger animals from entering. Certainly not large enough for a person. The water well tap was on the exterior of the property, accessible only if you knew where to dig. I had covered it carefully after sealing the bunker. There was no way someone had entered during the previous 17 days, which meant they had been here longer, which meant they had been here when I sealed the bunker, which meant the bunker was not as empty as I'd believed it to be when I closed the hatch and bolted the door and committed myself to whatever would happen next. I opened the notebook to the beginning and started reading. I read the first entries carefully, trying to understand who had written them, how they had found the bunker, what they had been doing in my space. The person who wrote the notebook was identifying themselves only as the occupant or the tenant. No name, no history, no explanation of how they had discovered the bunker entrance. Just the fact that they had found their way into the sealed space and decided to use it for shelter. The first entry established a timeline. October 14th, 2019. More than 18 months before the outbreak. More than 18 months before I would seal the bunker and commit myself to the assumption that I would be alone in this space. Someone had discovered the bunker, had found the entrance, which I had deliberately hidden, had concealed with landscaping and careful construction, and had decided to use it without asking permission, without revealing their presence. Bruce, the entry said, "The entrance is well hidden. It took me 3 days of careful observation to locate it. The architectural logic is impressive. The builder clearly understood how to conceal an entry while maintaining structural integrity. The frame is new, probably within the last 5 years. The builder is either paranoid or prescient. Either way, they're not here now, and this space is too good an opportunity to pass up." I turned the pages quickly, trying to understand what the person was doing in the bunker before the outbreak. Trying to understand what had brought someone to my property, to my carefully hidden bunker, in October of 2019. The next entries were sparse on detail, mostly observations about the bunker itself, notes about the systems, comments about the quality of the construction. Worse, there was a phrase that appeared multiple times: waiting for the owner to return. The occupant seemed to expect that I would show up at some point, that I would enter the bunker and discover them, that a confrontation would occur at some point. But I didn't. I didn't visit the bunker in October 2019. I didn't visit it in November or December. I didn't visit it during the entire winter of 2019 and 2020. I had purchased supplies for it, but I wasn't going to the physical space. I was maintaining the insurance policy from a distance, adding to my supplies gradually, waiting for the day when I might need to use it. The entries from early 2020 were different. The tone changed. The occupant seemed to have accepted that the owner, me, was not going to show up, that the bunker was available for long-term use, that they could settle in. Yet the entries from March 2020 mentioned the news, the reports of a strange illness in other parts of the world, the growing concern that something significant was developing. By April, the entries became more frequent. The occupant was clearly concerned. They were monitoring the news carefully. They were understanding in real time that the world was about to collapse into something unrecognizable. By May, the entries mentioned hearing sirens outside, the sound of vehicles passing on the road above, the sense that the situation was escalating. The final entries from June and July were different in tone again. The occupant had stopped trying to stay organized in the notebook. The handwriting became less controlled. The entries became shorter, more fragmented. The last entry, dated July 12, 2020, said, "Day 47 in the bunker, and the ventilation system is showing signs of strain. The air smells wrong. Too much carbon dioxide, I think. I tried the hand crank pump, but I'm not sure it's helping. I haven't been outside in nearly 2 weeks. The sounds from above stopped 3 days ago. Either the infected have moved on, or there's simply no more activity. No voices, no sirens, just silence. I need to decide whether to attempt to exit the bunker or try to remain here indefinitely. The supplies are adequate for another 2 weeks, maybe 3 if I ration carefully. I'm going to attempt to investigate the exit tomorrow. If I don't return to write another entry, assume I'm dead." There was no entry dated July 13th. The notebook ended with that final ambiguous statement. The occupant had either died in the attempt to leave the bunker, or had successfully left and never returned. The most likely scenario was death, either from infection contracted upon leaving or from the condition of the air in the bunker itself. Carbon dioxide accumulation can cause serious problems. The occupant had mentioned strain on the ventilation system, had mentioned that the air smelled wrong. It was entirely plausible that they had suffocated or become incapacitated by the air quality, that they had attempted to leave and had been killed by the infected outside, that they had managed to get some distance from the bunker before dying. I was standing in a space that had contained a dead person for months, or possibly longer, possibly the entire time I had been living in the bunker. I continued to explore the bunker more carefully after that, looking for evidence of the occupant, looking for anything that would confirm their presence beyond the notebook. There was a sleeping area in the second room, where I'd planned to have a bedroom if I ever needed to shelter in the bunker long term. The concrete floor showed signs of habitation. There was an indentation in the corner where a sleeping bag had been placed repeatedly. The walls showed marks where someone had been measuring time. 63 vertical marks grouped in sevens, with an additional 3 marks separate from the main group. The occupant had been counting days, marking the passage of time by hand on the concrete wall. The handwriting matched the notebook, the same precise, deliberate style. I found the body 2 hours after discovering the notebook. It was in the 3rd chamber of the bunker, the space I had designated as the mechanical room, and the space where the water pump, the ventilation system, and the electrical generator were located. The body had decomposed significantly. It was difficult to determine much about the person from what remained. There was clothing, male or female, I couldn't determine. The person had been approximately my height, maybe slightly taller. They had tried to reach the water pump when they died, or at least they had fallen near it. One arm was extended toward the pump mechanism, The other arm was at their side. The person had attempted to get water, possibly during the final hours of their life. I tried to calculate the timeline. The last entry was July 12th. The body had been decomposing for 9 months, since July of 2020. Nearly 300 days of slow decay in the enclosed space of the bunker. I sealed the room. I didn't do anything with the body immediately. I couldn't. I bolted the door to the mechanical room from the outside and then sealed the door frame with tape and plastic sheeting. I told myself I would deal with it later. I told myself that this was a temporary solution, that I would figure out what to do with human remains later, when I had processed the fact that they were there, when I had adjusted to the reality of sharing the bunker with a corpse, when I had determined whether the death posed any ongoing health risk to me. What I was trying not to think about was how the occupant had died. The last entry suggested that the air quality in the bunker was failing, that the ventilation system was insufficient, that the person had been experiencing symptoms consistent with carbon dioxide poisoning. Symptoms like headache, dizziness, and difficulty thinking clearly. If the air quality had been failing in July 2020, why was it not failing now? Why could I breathe without difficulty? Why did the air seem adequate to me? The occupant had died because the bunker couldn't support 2 people indefinitely. The occupant had died because the supplies and the systems I had designed were insufficient for survival beyond a certain period. And that period seemed to have ended in July of 2020, when the ventilation system had begun to fail under the strain of supporting a second inhabitant. I spent the next several days trying to understand what had happened. I reconstructed the timeline as best I could from the notes. The occupant had arrived in October 2019. They had been living in the bunker for 9 months before the outbreak accelerated in June and July of 2020, when they had been in the bunker during the initial collapse of civilization. They had been sheltering in place while the world above became increasingly dangerous and unstable. And they had died when the air quality in the bunker became insufficient to support human life. They had died in my bunker, in the space I had built to save myself, in the space I had now sealed myself into for potentially the rest of my life. The rational part of my mind kept circling back to one central question. How had the person found the bunker? The entrance was concealed. I had spent considerable effort hiding it. I had used landscaping to obscure it. I had constructed a false ground level to hide the actual entrance. I had done everything I could think of to make it invisible to casual observation, and the occupant's notebook mentioned that it had taken 3 days of observation to locate it. That suggested they had been on my property before I sealed the bunker. They had been watching. They had been studying the area. They had been specifically looking for shelter. They had somehow identified my property as a likely location for a bunker and had conducted surveillance to locate it. The other possibility, the one that I tried not to think about, but which kept intruding into my thoughts, was that there was someone else who had known about the bunker. Someone I had told, perhaps in passing, during a conversation where I wasn't careful about what I revealed. Someone who had decided to use it without my knowledge. Someone who had access to information about the bunker's location and basic layout, but I hadn't told anyone. I had been deliberately secretive about it. I had built it myself. I had purchased supplies gradually, always careful to maintain privacy. I had never mentioned the bunker to anyone. The only people who might know about it would be the contractors I had hired to help with some of the structural work in the basement. but that was in 2015, 5 years before the occupant arrived. And none of those contractors would have any reason to remember the work, much less to specifically plan to shelter in the bunker during a future outbreak that they couldn't have predicted. I tried to read the notebook again, more carefully, looking for clues about the occupant's identity, about their prior knowledge of the bunker, about why they had chosen this particular location. But the entries revealed very little about the person who wrote them. And they revealed a great deal about the bunker, about the systems, about the technical details of survival. But they revealed nothing about the writer. No name, no history, no explanation of motivation. Just the bare documentation of living in a concealed space, waiting for the world above to become safer, watching that hope erode as the situation worsened. One detail kept returning to my attention. In the third entry, the occupant had written, "The ventilation system is more sophisticated than I expected. Someone invested significant resources in this space. I need to figure out who." There was a gap between that entry and the next one. 3 weeks with no written documentation. When the occupant resumed writing, the tone was different. They had stopped trying to understand who had built the bunker. They had stopped trying to theorize about the builder's identity and motivations. They had simply accepted the bunker as existing, as available, as theirs to use. The change suggested that they had found something in the bunker that had answered their questions or had eliminated the need for them. Something that had made the question of the builder's identity less important than the fact of the bunker's existence. I searched the bunker more carefully, looking for what might have caused that change in perspective. I searched the storage room, I searched the living area, I searched every surface, every corner, every place where something might have been hidden. I found nothing, until I decided to examine the ventilation system more closely, until I examined the air filters. It's until I discovered that the filters were not the original equipment, that they had been modified, that someone had installed a different system than what I had originally constructed. Someone had upgraded the ventilation system, had improved it, had made modifications that would explain why the air quality was adequate for me, even though it had begun to fail for the previous occupant 9 months earlier. The modifications were sophisticated. Someone had added additional filters. Someone had improved the circulation mechanism. Someone had understood the engineering well enough to identify problems and implement solutions. The work was recent, not decades old. Within the last few years at most, within the last 18 months at minimum. Someone had been in the bunker, had spent time there. We had understood the technical requirements well enough to improve the systems. Someone had come into my bunker while I was not here and had decided it was necessary to modify the ventilation system to make it more effective. I realized at some point during this investigation that I had been standing in a space that had been modified by someone with technical knowledge, someone who understood structural engineering, someone who had identified problems with my original design and had taken it upon themselves to correct those problems. Someone had been in my bunker, had lived in my bunker, had died in my bunker, and before they died, they had improved the systems that were keeping me alive. The ventilation system that I'd been depending on for the past 17 days was not my original design. It was improved, modified, just maintained by someone who understood how to make it better. Someone who had cared enough about the sustainability of the space to invest time and effort in making it viable. I became aware gradually that I was experiencing something, some kind of emotional response to this revelation. I was becoming aware of the fact that I was not alone in the bunker. Not really. The dead occupant was there, the body was there, the remains were decomposing in the sealed room, but they were there. They were part of the space. They had left their mark on the space. They had improved the systems. They had shown concern for the viability of the bunker as a shelter. They had cared about the space even though it wasn't theirs. Even though they had found it by accident or through surveillance, they had cared enough to try to make it better. Or I began to spend more time in the bunker than seemed necessary. I began to explore spaces I had ignored. I began to examine the systems more carefully. I began to understand gradually that the occupant had done more than simply live in the space. They had studied it. They had documented it in the notebook. They had maintained it. They had made improvements. The notebooks were not the only record of their presence. The bunker itself was a record. Every modification was a conversation. Every improvement was a message. The person who had occupied the space was communicating with whoever would eventually discover the improvements. They were leaving information for the next person who would shelter in the bunker. The water system showed similar improvements. The occupant had modified the pump mechanism, had improved the filtration, had made the system more efficient. The electrical generator had been serviced. The oil had been changed. The filters had been replaced. The person had maintained the equipment as if they owned it, as if they were responsible for it, as if the bunker belonged to them. But they had also written in the notebook. They had left the notebook for someone to find. They had documented their improvements. They had left instructions, implicit in every notation, for how to maintain and operate the systems. I realized, after spending several days exploring the modifications, that the occupant had been more than a squatter. They had been something like a custodian. They had found the bunker. They had realized its potential. They had invested time and effort in maintaining it and improving it, and they had died maintaining it. Safe at the last entry mentioned the ventilation system showing signs of strain. The person had been trying to address the problem, had been attempting to fix the issue that was ultimately fatal to them, had been working on the system when they died. The extended arm toward the water pump might have been the occupant reaching for water in their final moments, or it might have been them reaching for something else, reaching toward a tool, reaching toward the pump system they had been working on, reaching toward the systems that they had tried so hard to maintain. I made the decision to leave the body in the sealed room, not as a matter of disrespect, but as a matter of practicality. The room was sealed. The body was sealed. To move it would require me to disturb the remains, to expose myself to whatever pathogens might remain, or to fundamentally alter the space in a way that would introduce chaos into the bunker. The sealed room became a tomb. It became a space that I acknowledged but did not enter. I installed a lock on the door, a second lock in addition to the one I had already installed. The message was clear, even if only to myself. This room is closed. This space is marked. This person is here, and this person is at rest. The notebook became my primary source of information about the bunker's systems. The improvements, the modifications, the details of how to maintain everything. The occupant had documented everything, had left a guide for whoever would come after them. I began to reread the notebook multiple times per day. I began to memorize passages. I began to understand that the notebook was a gift. The person who had written it, Puichitu, who had died in the bunker, had anticipated that someone else would eventually occupy the space. They had left a guide. They had left instructions. They had left themselves behind in the form of written documentation and physical improvements to the systems. The details of life in the bunker began to change after I accepted the presence of the corpse. I began to follow the routines that the notebook suggested. I began to operate the systems in the way the occupant had documented. I began to understand the bunker not as my construction, but as a shared space. A space that had been built by one person, occupied by another, and now occupied by me. A space with a history, a space with marks, a space with modifications and improvements and documentation left behind for whoever came next. I kept the notebook close to me at all times. I read passages repeatedly. I began to understand the occupant's personality through their writing. They were patient, they were detail-oriented, they understood systems, they understood engineering, they understood the difference between a bunker that could function for a few weeks and a bunker that could function for months or years. They had tried to make that difference. They had invested themselves in improving the systems, and then they had died, possibly, while working on those systems. The realization that eventually forced itself into my consciousness was this: the occupant might not have been alone either. The notation about the ventilation system showed signs of strain, suggested that the system was being pushed beyond its original capacity. The occupant had written about the air quality failing. But the occupant had also written about investigating the ventilation system, about working on the pump mechanism. What if they had not been alone? What if someone else had been in the bunker? What if the strain on the ventilation system had been caused not by a single additional occupant, but by multiple people? I searched for evidence of a second occupant or multiple occupants. I looked for additional sleeping areas. I found marks on the walls that might have been additional time-counting systems. The marks were different from the occupants' documented marks. The style was different. The groupings were different. Someone else had been marking time in the bunker. Someone else had been present. The body in the sealed room was one person, but there might have been others. The thought became obsessive. Yet the bunker suddenly seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a communal space. A space that had hosted multiple refugees from the collapse of the world above. A space that had been designed for one person, modified by one person, but ultimately attempted to shelter more than one person. A space that had failed them. A space that had become a tomb. I decided to leave the bunker. I made this decision carefully, rationally understanding the risks. The world above was dangerous. The infected were still present. The infection vectors were unclear. The survival prospects outside the bunker were minimal. But the alternative was to remain indefinitely in a space that contained human remains. In a space that had been a collective shelter for people I would never know. It's in a space that was fundamentally changed by the knowledge of what had happened inside it. I spent 3 days preparing. I reviewed the medical supplies. I checked the notebooks for any suggestions about how to venture outside. The occupant had not documented any attempt to leave. The final entry suggested they were planning to investigate the exit, but there was no record of the actual attempt. I packed supplies. I prepared protective equipment. I cleaned myself and my clothes. I told myself that I was doing everything right, that I was being careful, that I was maximizing my survival prospects. On the morning of the 19th day in the bunker, I unbolted the hatch. I pushed it open. The light from above was harsh and painful. The air from above was cold and carried the smell of decay. I climbed the stairs slowly. I emerged into the basement of my house. Nothing had changed. The house was exactly as I'd left it. The same dust on the shelves, the same emptiness, the same silence. I moved through the basement and up to the ground floor. The house was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing had been disturbed. I moved to the windows and looked outside. The street was empty. The houses across from mine showed no signs of activity, no sound, no movement, no evidence of the infected, though that might have just meant they were not currently visible, not that they were not present. I stayed in the house for several hours, gathering supplies, preparing myself for the exterior world. I had managed through careful rationing to make the bunker supplies last. But I needed water. I needed fresh supplies. I needed to find other people each year, or at least determine whether other people existed anymore. I needed to understand what had happened in the 9 months since the occupant had died in the bunker. I left the house at approximately 2:47 p.m. on day 19. I was carrying a backpack with supplies. I was wearing a mask of some kind, an N95 that I'd found in the house, knowing that it would provide minimal protection against most infection vectors, but feeling better for having it anyway. I was armed with a crowbar from the garage, knowing that it would be largely useless against an infected human, but again, feeling better for having it. The exterior world was quieter than I'd expected. There were no bodies visible. There were no people at all. There was no movement except for wind pushing debris across the street. It was a Tuesday, or at least I thought it was a Tuesday. I had been counting days carefully, but I had lost track somewhere during my investigation of the bunker. The sky was clear. The sun was beginning to decline toward the west. It was mid-afternoon. In another 4 hours, it would be dark. I moved through the neighborhood systematically, checking buildings, looking for signs of other people. Most houses were locked. Some had broken windows, suggesting that they had been entered by the infected or by survivors looking for supplies. One house had a door that was ajar. I approached it carefully. I moved through the entrance slowly. The interior was disturbed. Furniture overturned, supplies scattered, signs of a struggle. I moved into the kitchen and found 2 bodies. They had been dead for a long time, months at minimum. They had been infected, I think, and based on the condition of the bodies and the evidence of trauma, they had died violently. One had a wound on the head. The other had wounds on the shoulders and arms, suggesting they had been fighting. They might have been fighting the infection. They might have been fighting each other. There was no way to determine which. I left the house and continued moving through the neighborhood. I found a grocery store that had been broken into. The shelves were mostly empty. Some items remained, items that were not immediately useful. Canned soups with expiration dates from 2019, suggesting they had been there for years before the outbreak. Items that people had left behind, items that had been overlooked in the panic and chaos of the initial collapse. I took what I could carry and continued moving. By the time darkness began to approach, I had moved approximately 2 miles from my house. I had seen no people, no infected, No signs of recent human activity except for the evidence of earlier looters who had moved through the area months ago. I found a building that seemed reasonably secure. An old bank, abandoned decades before the outbreak, with solid walls and doors that I could secure. I barricaded myself inside. I ate some of the supplies I'd brought from my house. I tried to sleep, knowing that sleep would be difficult, knowing that I was now exposed to the danger that I'd sheltered from in the bunker. I'm writing this from inside the bank. It's 3:12 a.m. I haven't been able to sleep. I keep thinking about the occupant. I keep thinking about the improvements they made to the systems. I keep thinking about the fact that they died trying to maintain the bunker, trying to make it viable, trying to keep it functional for whoever came after them. I keep thinking about the marks on the walls that suggested there might have been other people, other survivors, other refugees who had sought shelter in the space and who had either died or moved on or were still out there somewhere. I'm thinking about going back to the bunker. I'm thinking about sealing myself back in. The supplies might last another month or two if I'm careful. The systems are functional. The water is available, the air is breathable. The occupant made sure of that. The occupant improved the systems so that they would be more viable, and then the occupant died. But the systems continued to work. They continued to function. They were functional when I sealed the bunker entrance. And they will likely continue to be functional for some indefinite period. But there's something else I'm thinking about, something that I'm trying not to focus on, but which keeps returning to my consciousness. The occupant wrote about wanting to determine who had built the bunker. They wrote about trying to figure out my identity. And then there was a gap in the entries, a period of time where they were not documenting their observations. And when they resumed writing, the question of the builder's identity seemed less important. Something had changed their perspective. Something had made the question less urgent. What if the occupant had found something? What if the occupant had discovered documentation about me? Information about the builder? What if they had found photographs, names, contact information? What if they had discovered something that made them understand who had built the bunker and why? And what if they had left that information somewhere, hidden somewhere, waiting for the next person to discover it? I'm trying to decide whether to go back, whether to return to the bunker and search more carefully, whether to look for what the occupant might have found, whether to discover what caused the shift in their perspective, whether to understand what they had learned about the builder, about me. I'm trying to decide whether I want to know this information, whether I want to discover what might be waiting in the bunker, what documentation might exist, what the occupant knew about me. The bunker is waiting. The body is waiting. The systems are functioning. The improvements are waiting to be understood, and the information is waiting to be discovered. I think I'm going to go back. I think the answer to something important is waiting in the bunker. I think the occupant left something for me to find, something that explains why they were searching for the builder, something that explains what they discovered, something that explains the shift in perspective, something that makes the builder's identity important enough to investigate, but not important enough to write about directly. I'm going to pack what I have. I'm going to move back toward the house. I'm going to enter the bunker again. I'm going to search more carefully. This time I'm going to look for hidden documentation. I'm going to look for what the occupant found during that 3-week gap in their entries, during I'm going to find whatever caused them to stop asking questions about who built the bunker, and I'm going to discover what they found out. Because I'm beginning to understand something. The occupant didn't stop asking about the builder's identity because they gave up. They stopped asking because they found the answer. They found something that answered the question completely, something that made asking questions unnecessary, something that made my identity as the builder less important than whatever they had discovered about the purpose of the bunker. And now I need to know what that discovery was. Now I need to understand what the occupant found. Now I need to go back into the bunker and find what they left behind. Because if I don't, if I remain out here in the exterior world, uncertain and confused and alone, then I'm essentially abandoning the bunker to whatever future is waiting. I'm abandoning the space that the occupant died maintaining. I'm abandoning the systems they improved. I'm abandoning the information they documented in the notebook. But if I go back, if I enter the bunker again, if I search for what the occupant found, then I might discover something that changes everything. I might discover something that explains the modifications to the ventilation system. I might discover something that explains why the occupant was so invested in maintaining the bunker. I might discover something that explains the purpose of the bunker itself. I'm going to go back and when I do, I'm going to find whatever the occupant discovered, because the truth is waiting there. And the truth is something that the occupant thought was important enough to investigate, even if they didn't think it was important enough to document. The truth is something that changed their perspective. The truth is something that made survival in the bunker seem less like a temporary shelter and more like something else. Something that they needed to maintain, something that they needed to protect. I'm returning to the bunker. I'm going back to the space that contains the body of the person who died trying to maintain it. I'm going back to find what they discovered. I'm going back to find the answer to the question they stopped asking. And when I find it, I'm going to understand something that I don't currently understand. Something about the bunker, something about the occupant, something about why they were searching for information about the builder. Something about what I've been missing all along. The bunker is waiting. The answer is waiting. And I'm going to go back and find it, even though I'm beginning to suspect that finding it might change what I think I know about the bunker entirely.